Back in my mid-20s, sometime during the late 1980s, I was completely consumed by my love for hiking and camping. Rhode Island. My tiny home state, barely a wrinkle on the map, offered only so many places to explore. I tore through every local trail and campground until nothing felt new anymore. I started hungering for something raw, untamed, somewhere the silence had weight. Everyone in the hiking community spoke of the Appalachian Trail as if it were a rite of passage. My uncle on my father's side had conquered the entire thing back in the 50s and never missed a chance to remind me. Whenever hiking came up, his eyes lit with that distant gleam. His stories painted the mountains like they were a different world, one dripping with mystery and beauty. His tales took root in me. I decided that one summer I would trace his footsteps. Time off from work was scarce, so a full trail journey was impossible. Still, if I planned it right, I could cover the southern stretch from Harper's Ferry all the way to Asheville, North Carolina in a couple of weeks. It felt like the perfect compromise, a sliver of wilderness large enough to quiet the noise of everyday life. So, in the summer of 1989, I packed everything: tent, hammock, supplies onto my back, and rode the bus and train down to Harper's Ferry. After grabbing the last bits of gear I needed, I stepped onto the trail that would define that year of my life. The first few days nearly broke me. The climbs were brutal, my legs screamed, and I'd never felt exhaustion bite so deep. Still, something about it thrilled me. The ache, the solitude, the promise of open sky. I slept each night in a hammock strung between trees, because I'd heard unsettling things about West Virginia's insects. Creatures with names that belonged in nightmares. Assassin bugs with dagger-like mouths. Cow-killer ants whose sting was said to drop livestock. Probably rumors, I told myself, but rumors strong enough to make me prefer swinging above the ground. The hammock wasn't comfort. It was survival. I'd drift off listening to the nocturnal chorus, owls, frogs, things I couldn't name, and each sound seemed too close, too deliberate. Every snap of a twig pulled me halfway back from sleep. It was irritating, but I told myself that's what I'd come for, to feel the pulse of nature, even when it frightened me. Then came that night. I woke to a faint rustling, leaves whispering against each other nearby. I rolled slightly, eyes straining against the dark, and my stomach turned to ice. A silhouette, tall, human, unmoving, stood over me. For a heartbeat, I couldn't even breathe. Then instinct took control. In one motion, I flung myself out of the hammock and bolted into the trees, crashing through undergrowth like an animal fleeing fire. Whoever stood over me had no good reason to be there. People don't watch sleeping strangers in the woods unless something's very wrong. I ran until my lungs burned, then crouched behind a tree, forcing air into my chest. When I dared to circle back toward camp, every step felt like wading through ice. My tiny clearing looked untouched, gear still there, no sign of movement, but the air felt wrong. Too still. I grabbed my pack, every nerve screaming, and left. For the next few days, I hiked with a kind of fever, pushing myself farther south than my map suggested. Distance felt like safety. Eventually, the tension dulled, but sleep refused to come easy. Every creak of branches sounded like breath near my ear. In one small town I passed through, I bought fishing line and a few empty cans, a makeshift security system. That night I strung tripwires between trees around my camp. Any foot that brushed them would rattle the cans and wake me. Primitive maybe, but it gave me comfort. It worked, at first. One night, the clatter yanked me awake, heart in my throat. I rolled out, knife ready, only to find a fox dashing away into the moonlight. I laughed then, the relief sharp enough to hurt, and promised myself I'd stop sleeping with a blade in my hand before I became my own worst danger. Days passed. The shadow figure faded into memory. I was nearly 100 miles from where it happened and told myself it was over, just an unlucky encounter with some drifter or night hunter. For the first time in weeks, peace began to settle in. But peace in the wilderness never lasts. That night, I woke suddenly, and something was wrong. I couldn't move. My arms were trapped tight against my sides. The hammock's fabric pressed against my face so hard I could barely breathe. It felt like being wrapped alive. A sharp snap cut through the dark rope, breaking, and then the world flipped. I slammed into the dirt. The breath punched out of me. Before I could orient myself, the ground began sliding beneath me. The hammock was moving. Someone was dragging me, pulling the entire bundle through the forest. I screamed into the suffocating cloth, thrashing, kicking, but it only made the world sway faster. My knife was packed away, unreachable. Panic boiled in my throat. Whoever had been standing over me before was back, and this time, they'd come prepared. In the chaos, one thought pierced through. My watch. My father's old wristwatch. The one with a jagged clasp that had nicked me more than once. It was still on my wrist. Clutching at it blindly, I unclasped it with shaking fingers and pinched the tiny metal hook between my thumb and forefinger. Then, I started sawing at the hammock's fabric. The rough edge tore through the canvas bit by bit, whispering as it cut. I saw a flicker of moonlight through the first tear. Then another. Adrenaline drowned out fear. I shredded and clawed until the fabric gave way, until I could rip myself free, gasping, gulping air like it was fire. For a split second, I was reborn, free from a cloth coffin that wanted to carry me into the dark. Then, I ran. I don't remember choosing a direction, only that I moved faster than I thought a man could move. About a week slipped by, and I had nearly convinced myself the nightmare had dissolved into nothing more than a warped memory. By then, I must have been close to 100 miles south of where it first happened, and each night had been mercifully calm apart from the one encounter with the mischievous fox that startled the breath out of me. With my little string and an alarm rigged around my camps, I began, at last, to surrender to real sleep again. But that peace shattered one night when I woke to find something terribly wrong. My body refused to move, my arms pinned tight against my sides, my face pressed hard into coarse fabric. The hammock that usually cradled me felt different, tight, suffocating, as if it had folded in on itself and swallowed me whole. My half-awake mind barely grasped what was happening when the fabric above me snapped with a sharp crack. Then came the sudden plunge, thud. The earth knocked the air from my lungs. I gasped, stunned, disoriented, and that's when the dread turned solid. The ground beneath me shifted. I was being dragged. The hammock, no. The cocoon was sliding across the forest floor, scraping over roots and stones. Whoever was out there had sliced the ropes that tied me to the trees and bound me up inside the fabric like prey. I screamed into the darkness, throat burning, demanding to be released. Only the rasp of fabric against dirt answered me. No reply, no footsteps. Just that slow, steady pull into deeper woods. Panic surged, but instinct took over. I needed something sharp. Anything. My knife, I realized bitterly, was back at my belt, beyond the layers of canvas, wound tight around me. But then a faint thought flickered. My father's old wristwatch, the latch-aged metal, worn thin, had a jagged edge that had drawn blood once before. Maybe, just maybe, it could do the same to fabric. I twisted my wrists until I could unbuckle the strap. The motion was clumsy. Every jolt of movement made the hammock shudder. But eventually, I freed it. Pinching the clasp between my fingers, I scraped it against the fabric, sawing and tearing through the threads. It was slow, agonizing work. My heart pounded louder than the dragging sounds. But after what felt like forever, a faint gleam of moonlight appeared through a frayed slit. I clawed at it, cutting faster, ignoring the sting of splinters and rope burns. The material split wider until at last it gave way, and I tore myself free, gasping for breath, erupting from that suffocating shroud like something reborn. The air was cold and wet on my face. The forest lay ghost still. I didn't look back. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms as I sprinted blindly through the black woods. Terror propelled me faster than reason could follow. Whoever had hunted me through those miles of trail, they were still out there. They'd tracked me, crossed my tripwires, waited for their moment. Whoever they were, they knew those mountains better than I ever could. By the time the faint glow of a porch light appeared through the trees, my legs were shaking. I stumbled toward it, slammed my fists on the door until it opened. A startled family stood blinking at me, and I must have looked like death itself, mud-streaked, trembling, wild-eyed. They let me inside without question, sat me near their hearth while I tried to explain between gasps what had happened. At dawn, a sheriff drove up in a dust-coated pickup, his hat low, his eyes skeptical. Together we retraced my steps through the forest. We found the clearing where my camp had been. My pack, scattered gear, ashes of the fire. But the hammock, the evidence, was gone, vanished, as if the woods had swallowed it whole. I told him everything, down to the smallest detail. The sound of the snapping ropes, the dragging motion, the knife I never reached for. He listened, nodding, but his expression said he didn't buy a word of it. He suggested I might have gotten lost, that exhaustion and fear had conjured a phantom attacker. Maybe a dream, he said, a trick of sleeplessness and dark. But I know what I saw. My palms still sweat even now when I think about that sound of rustling fabric sliding through dead leaves. It was real. As real as the scar the watch clasp left on my thumb. I never did finish that dream hike. The very next day, I caught a bus heading back toward Harper's Ferry, then boarded a train bound for Providence. I told only a handful of people what happened on that trail. Most would have laughed, called it a fireside tale, something to scare new hikers. For years I kept quiet, even from my uncle, the one who'd inspired me to go. When I finally confessed, expecting mockery, he just nodded slowly, his eyes distant. There were nights, he said, when I didn't think I'd make it out either. He told me there are people up in those ridges families who've lived off-grid for generations. Folks who don't answer to laws or boundaries, who move through those woods like shadows. He'd had his own close calls. He admitted encounters with people whose eyes carried something ancient, things best left unseen. He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. Some knowledge is heavier than fear. I've told myself, I'll try that Appalachian adventure again someday when I'm older, wiser, maybe better armed. The trail will still be there, waiting beneath the endless canopy. But then again, so might the thing or the someone who tried to drag me away that night. Randall Lee Smith grew up as an only child in the quiet, mountain-wrapped town of Parisburg, Virginia, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and gossip traveled faster than the wind through the trees. People remembered his mother as a soft-spoken, solitary woman who earned her living working long hours in the laundry room at the local Gauss Memorial Hospital. But she carried a strange habit, one that would later become a town whisper. For the first few years of Randall's life, she dressed her son in girls' clothing. No one ever knew why. Perhaps loneliness had shaped her choices, or grief, or something that no one ever dared to name. Whatever the reason, it left an invisible mark on the boy. By the time he reached school, classmates described Randall as an odd, withdrawn child, quiet, but deceptive. He spun grand tales of adventures he'd never had, and money he didn't own. His classmates branded him LR, short for Lying Randall. The name stuck. When the noise of the world grew too much, Randall escaped into the Appalachian wilderness. The hills became his cathedral, a place where the trees whispered secrets, and no one demanded truth from him. He could vanish for days, wandering through the dense, mist-heavy trails that stretched for over 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine. After high school, he drifted from job to job, handyman, mechanic, laborer. He didn't crave stability. The uncertainty gave him freedom to roam, to disappear into the woods whenever the urge struck. To most hikers, the Appalachian Trail was a pilgrimage, a retreat from the noise of modern life. But for Randall, it was something else, an obsession, a refuge, and eventually, a hunting ground. Those trails had seen many tragedies. The Appalachian wilderness, as breathtaking as it was, carried its share of blood-soaked legends. In time, it would bear Randall's too. It was the spring of 1981, when two social workers from Maine, Susan Ramsey and Robert Mountford, both 27, set out to hike the Appalachian Trail to raise funds for mental health awareness. They were bright, optimistic, and kind, the kind of people who found meaning in giving. Along their route, they befriended a fellow hiker, agreeing to meet again in Pearisburg, Randall Smith's hometown, for a meal and a reunion. But when Susan and Robert never arrived, their friends' concern grew into alarm. Days passed, and the call to the local sheriff's office was made. Deputy Tom Lawson led a team of officers into the mountains. They questioned hikers, searched shelters, combed through miles of trail. One group reported seeing the couple days earlier speaking with a strange man near a small wooden structure called the Wapiti Shelter. The man's behavior, they said, had been odd. Something about him made their skin crawl. The search team made their way to that shelter. By the time they arrived, the 30th of May, 1981, 11 days had passed since the last sighting of the missing hikers. Hope was running thin. Inside the shelter, one deputy spotted a dark stain on the wooden floorboards. Blood. They spread out, combing the area. Not far away, they discovered a small clearing where the leaves seemed unnaturally arranged. A crude attempt at concealment. When they brushed them aside, they found a sleeping bag. Inside it lay the body of Susan Ramsey. The next day, search dogs found Robert's body buried near a tree stump, also wrapped in a sleeping bag. He had been shot once in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Susan's death had been far worse. Multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma. Their bodies had been dragged from the shelter and hidden like discarded prey. Investigators scoured the scene, finding Susan's camera with the film ripped out and stolen, perhaps a trophy. In her backpack, they found a paperback novel, taken in for fingerprint analysis. The results shocked them. The prints didn't belong to Robert. They belonged to Randall Lee Smith. When deputies arrived at Randall's home, he was gone. But what they found inside chilled them. Blood-stained clothing, belongings of the victims, a stash of pornographic material, and something far worse, crude medical tools, fashioned into disturbing toys. A handwritten note lay on a table, claiming Randall had been kidnapped and would soon be executed in obvious ploy to mislead investigators. Randall Smith was no longer lying Randall. He had become something far more dangerous. Days passed without a trace. Law enforcement scoured the mountains, but Randall had vanished into the wild he knew better than anyone. Deputies and rangers were stretched thin, and even Deputy Lawson, exhausted and haunted by what he'd seen, took a brief vacation with his family to Myrtle Beach. But fate wasn't finished with him. While in South Carolina, Lawson received an urgent call. A man matching Randall's description had been arrested in Myrtle Beach, hundreds of miles from Pearisburg. The suspect claimed amnesia, said he couldn't remember who he was or how he'd gotten there. But his body told another story covered in insect bites, his skin raw and swollen, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent days trekking through the Appalachian wilderness. The deputies devised a clever trap. They told the man he couldn't receive medical treatment until he signed a consent form. They slid the paper across the table, pen in hand. The man hesitated, then wrote his name, Randall Lee Smith. At 27 years old, the Appalachian Trail killer had been caught. He was extradited to Virginia and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Initially, prosecutors aimed for the death penalty, but in a bizarre twist, Randall accepted a plea deal, 30 years in prison instead of execution. The families of the victims were divided. One father, an Episcopalian minister, opposed the death penalty and accepted the plea. Others were furious. 30 years for 2 lives. 30 years for what he'd done in those woods. But the law was the law. Randall Smith was sent away and the Appalachian Trail exhaled, if only for a time. Randall Smith grew up as an only child in the quiet town of Pearisburg, Virginia, a place so small it felt trapped in time. The townsfolk remembered his mother as a kind but distant woman, a laundry worker at the local hospital who preferred solitude over social circles. Yet, for reasons no one ever understood, she dressed young Randall in girls' clothing during his early years. What that did to the boy's psyche, no one could say for certain, but it carved something hollow inside him, something that never healed. At school, Randall became the loner, the odd one out. He had no real friends, only stories. Tales of adventures he never took, fortunes he never owned, and lies that poured from his mouth so easily, they earned him a cruel nickname, L.R. Lying Randall, the wilderness became his refuge. He would vanish into the Appalachian mountains for days, walking alone through the mist-drenched woods, where the trees whispered secrets and the earth seemed to breathe beneath his boots. The Appalachian Trail was his escape, and perhaps the only place he ever felt alive. Years passed. Randall drifted through life, doing odd jobs across Virginia. Handyman, laborer, wanderer. He liked the freedom, the rootlessness, the call of the mountains. But freedom, for him, was never about peace. It was about distance from people, from judgment, from whatever darkness was coiled inside him. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles, from Georgia to Maine, a pilgrim's path for hikers seeking solitude or salvation. But sometimes, the trail gives birth to something else, monsters, cloaked in humanity. It had seen horrors before, drifters, killers, and lost souls. And in the spring of 1981, that darkness would awaken again. Two social workers from Maine, Susan Ramsey and Robert Mountford, set out to hike the trail, raising money for a mental health charity. They were young, idealistic, and full of light. But light attracts shadows. They met another hiker along the way, a friendly face, and promised to meet again in Parisburg for a meal. But the reunion never happened. When they failed to show up, their trail companion alerted the authorities. Deputy Tom Lawson and a few officers began the search, asking hikers if they had seen the missing couple. Most hadn't, but one group spoke of a strange man behaving erratically near the Wapiti shelter, a wooden rest stop deep in the forest. The deputies followed the lead. On May 30th, 1981, after 11 long days, they reached the shelter. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with something darker, something metallic. A blood stain on the floorboard told them they were too late. A few yards away, they found a mound of leaves unnaturally shaped. Beneath it lay a sleeping bag with a heavy shape inside. When they cut it open, the woods fell silent. Susan Ramsey stared back at them, lifeless. The next day, a sniffer dog found Robert Mountford, buried near a stump shot, once in the head with a .22 pistol. Susan had been stabbed and bludgeoned before being dragged from the shelter and left to rot under the leaves. Among her belongings, deputies found a paperback book inside her backpack. Fingerprints were lifted from its cover. One set belonged to her, the other to Randall Lee Smith. Deputies stormed Randall's home. He wasn't there. But what they found chilled them to the bone. Blood-stained clothes, the victim's possessions, and disturbing medical instruments twisted into grotesque shapes. A handwritten note declared he'd been kidnapped and doomed to die, but the handwriting was his own. A pathetic ruse. The hunt began. For days, police combed the Appalachian woods, searching for the man who knew them better than anyone. But Randall had vanished into his sanctuary, the forest. Fate, however, had other plans. Deputy Lawson, on vacation in Myrtle Beach, received a call. A man had been arrested there, disoriented, covered in insect bites, claiming amnesia. When asked to sign a medical form, he scrawled his name in shaky handwriting. Randall Lee Smith. He was just 27 years old, charged with double homicide. The death penalty loomed until a plea deal spared his life in exchange for a 30-year sentence. But he served only 15. In 1996, Randall walked out of prison. Older, thinner, and unrepentant. He returned to Pearisburg, moving back into his dead mother's house, a ghost among townsfolk who wished him dead. He kept to himself, spending his days wandering the same trails where he had killed. Some hikers even spoke with him unaware that they were sharing stories with a murderer. By 2008, he seemed to have finally given up. He packed a small bag, took his dog Bo, and disappeared into the mountains. Months later, two fishermen, Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer, were camping near Brushy Mountain, not far from the old Wapiti shelter. It was a peaceful evening until a stranger emerged from the trees, stooped, pale, and smiling faintly. He called himself Ricky Williams. They shared their fire, their food, and their warmth with the drifter and his dog. He told stories, absurd ones, about NASA, wealth, and beauty queens, lies so transparent they almost seemed childlike. Scott and Sean humored him. After all, they were just being kind. As night fell, they urged him to return to his camp before dark swallowed the forest. Ricky thanked them and turned to leave. Then, without warning, he drew a .22 pistol and opened fire. 4 shots tore through the night. Sean was hit in the temple. Scott in the neck. Bleeding and delirious, they ran through trees, through pain, through fear. Randall followed, reloading. Sean reached his truck, slamming the door just as Randall raised his gun again. Click. The weapon jammed. He was out of bullets. They sped away, headlights slicing through the black forest, certain death chasing them from behind. They reached a farmhouse and pounded on the door, their bodies pouring blood. Inside, Melissa Miller and her son Randy dragged them to safety, pressed towels to their wounds, and called 911. Minutes felt like lifetimes. By the time helicopters arrived, both men were on the edge of death. But they lived. And when police caught up to Randall driving one of their stolen trucks, his fate was sealed. He tried to escape, but his truck flipped, trapping him inside. A trooper found him conscious, staring with eyes that were described as the coldest ever seen. Randall Lee Smith was taken to the same hospital as his victims. Days later, in his cell, he was found unresponsive, dead at 54. No wounds, no struggle, just gone. They said he died of natural causes, but some whispered he simply let go, denied the satisfaction of killing again. He was buried beside his mother in a quiet graveyard. His loyal dog, Bo, was adopted by a loving family. Perhaps the only pure soul to come from his story. The most terrifying thing about Randall Smith wasn't the blood he spilled. It was the absence of reason. He killed not out of hate or greed or vengeance, but because he could. Because watching life fade gave him a godlike thrill. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Because monsters like him don't live in shadows or stories. They walk beside us, they smile, and sometimes they ask to share your fire. Geraldine Largay kept a small black notebook, her constant companion, on a journey that would stretch across the spine of America's wilderness. It was the summer of 2013, and her dream was to conquer the Appalachian Trail. Because of her slow, deliberate pace, fellow hikers called her Inchworm, a name that suited her perfectly. But despite her speed, she covered incredible ground, almost 1,000 miles from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, always with her close friend, Jane Lee, by her side. Her husband, George Largay, the love of her life for 42 years, followed along by car. He would drive ahead, preparing care packages, arranging pickup points, and occasionally rescuing them for a night in a warm motel, a brief escape from the cold bite of the trail. Then, on June 30th, as they entered New Hampshire, fate began to unravel. Jane received a call, a family emergency, forcing her to abandon the trail. Geraldine, however, refused to quit. The end was near. She was determined to finish. But Jane would later admit that Geraldine had always struggled with direction. She would often wander off path, become confused, then flustered when she realized her mistake. And when she found herself alone, deep in the wild, Geraldine made one final, devastating wrong turn, one that led her into the unforgiving wilderness of Maine, into terrain so remote it was used by the National Guard for military training. Even lost, Geraldine kept writing. Her notebook entries continued, her words growing thinner, more desperate as her food supply dwindled and her hope slowly dimmed. She had wandered into one of the most rugged, tangled sections of the Appalachian wild. The forest there was a living labyrinth, thick underbrush, fir trees packed so tightly that sunlight itself struggled to find its way in. You step off the trail a little, turn around, and suddenly it's gone, said one volunteer who maintained the area. You could walk in circles for hours without knowing it. Realizing she was lost, Geraldine climbed to higher ground, clutching her phone, praying for a signal. Her first message, sent in panic, read, "Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do. Please." She tried again and again messages to George that never reached him. In some trouble. Got off trail to go to the bathroom. Now lost. She begged him to contact the Appalachian Mountain Club. Maybe a trail maintainer could help her, but no signal ever broke through the heavy canopy. By late July, she set up her tent beneath the hemlocks, atop pine needles and sticks hidden from the sky. She tied a silver emergency blanket between 2 trees, a desperate beacon meant to shimmer in the sunlight. But the forest swallowed her whole. The foliage was too dense, the shadows too deep. No helicopter, no search team ever saw the glint. She was supposed to meet George on July 23rd in Wyman Township. She never arrived. The next day, George reported her missing. Search parties were dispatched, helicopters, dogs, volunteers, even mounted units. They combed the woods tirelessly, and yet, cruelly, Geraldine was less than a mile from the trail, so close that searchers likely passed within shouting distance of her campsite, unaware that she lay hidden just beyond the trees. Then came the false leads. People called in claiming she'd been murdered, that she was seen tied up in trees. Others swore they'd seen her with strange men, or that she'd drowned in a river. Psychics phoned with their visions. One said she'd broken her ankle. Another insisted she was alive in a women's shelter in Tennessee. These falsehoods wasted precious time, and some even accused George of abuse, though he had never once raised a hand to her. In her final entry, Geraldine faced her fate with heartbreaking grace. "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness to let them know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now." It took 2 years before a logging company surveyor stumbled upon what searchers had missed: her campsite and her remains, still inside her sleeping bag. Geraldine Inchworm, Largay retired, nurse, devoted wife, quiet dreamer, had survived a month alone in the wilderness, longer than most thought possible. She died of exposure and starvation, surrounded by the remnants of her final hope. Around her lay her last earthly possessions: a blue and white bandana, a rosary, 2 water bottles, one still half full, birthday candles, lighters, dental floss, a sewing kit, everything meticulously arranged, as if she'd been trying to preserve some final sense of order as the forest closed in. When her family finally reached the site, they placed a white wooden cross there. Messages scrawled in black marker. One, written in a child's uneven hand, read simply, "I wish you were. It is terrifying that in a land so vast, so populated, someone can still vanish completely. That civilization, with all its abundance, can end so sharply at the tree line. America may be tamed, but there are still corners where the wild refuses to surrender, and where the forest remembers every lost soul who steps too far from the path." Hi everyone, my name is Lena. I'm Malay, and a few years ago, I spent a summer in the United States for a summer school program at Virginia Tech University. It was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure, the kind that changes the way you see the world. The program was full of extracurricular activities, and honestly, what else could we do with all that free time? I made so many new friends, students from every corner of the globe, and together we spent those long, golden afternoons doing all sorts of incredible things. But of all the experiences that summer gifted me, one stood out like no other. A hiking trip up into the Appalachian Mountains. I remember how breathtaking it was. The endless horizon of green ridges folding over one another, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, and the wind that whispered through the forest canopy. I even took pictures, snapshots that to this day feel more like dreams than memories. It was, without question, one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, and one of the most terrifying, because on that mountain during that hike, I had an encounter that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. We had stopped to rest. The air was hot, the trail steep, so we sat on a patch of flattened grass, eating snacks and sipping from water bottles that had long lost their chill. I was chatting with my closest friends from the trip, Sol and Gabby, laughing about something silly, when suddenly we heard it. A faint rustling in the foliage beside us. Before we could even turn to look, our guide whispered, and I will never forget the sound of his voice. "Don't move. No one move a muscle." He'd been so confident the whole trip. One of those rugged, outdoorsy types. Calm, sure, even a little cocky. But the tremor in his voice turned my blood to ice. I froze. Every sound, the wind, the insects, the crunch of the forest vanished into silence. My eyes drifted toward the sound, and when I finally saw what was stepping out of the brush, I couldn't even scream. It was a bear, a black bear, massive, dark, silent, walking straight toward us. I'd read before that black bears have poor eyesight but extraordinary smell. I guess the scent of our snacks had reached it through the thick mountain air. Even though we weren't cooking anything, the faint aroma of food must have been enough to lure it close, far too close. I stayed completely still as it approached, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it. Then, without warning, it rose up standing tall on its hind legs, and I swear my heart nearly stopped altogether. You think you know what fear is, until you find yourself staring up at a creature like that, muscles shifting under fur, its nose twitching inches from your face. I'd known in theory that black bears were smaller and less aggressive than grizzlies or polar bears, but when you're face to face with one, size doesn't matter. It towered over me, at least 6 feet tall, sniffing at the fabric of my hijab. My body trembled uncontrollably, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes as I forced myself to remain perfectly still. One wrong move, one startled breath, and that would have been the end of me. Then, as suddenly as it had come to me, it lost interest. It turned slow, deliberate toward my friend Sol, who had dropped her sandwich in sheer panic. The bear sniffed at the fallen food, ignored it, and then stood up again, this time close enough to brush her face with its breath. And just like that, it turned away. Without a sound, it disappeared into the shadows of the trees, melting back into the forest as if it had never existed at all. For a long moment, none of us breathed. Then, in perfect unison, we all exhaled, whispering prayers of thanks under our breath, trembling and overwhelmed with relief. We had survived something primal, something ancient. Never in all my life had I been so close to something so powerful and so wild. It left a scar on me, not one you can see, but one I can feel whenever I'm out in nature. That encounter taught me a deep, lasting respect for the wilderness, for how alive it truly is, how indifferent it can be to our existence. And every time I think back to that day, one thought chills me to the bone. If that hadn't been a black bear, if it had been a grizzly, somewhere out in the Pacific Northwest, I probably wouldn't be here telling you this story. When I was a kid growing up in North Carolina, I was part of the Boy Scouts of America. Yeah, I know it sounds kind of corny now, but honestly, those days, they made up some of the best memories of my childhood. Sure, my friends like to crack jokes nowadays about how weird scout leaders can be, but truth be told, nothing like that ever happened to me. It was all clean, fun fishing, camping, fieldcraft, community service, good old-fashioned outdoors stuff. It gave my parents a break and gave me something to look forward to every summer. Well, except for one summer, because that one became something else entirely. That trip that night still creeps back into my thoughts sometimes, especially when the Smoky Mountains come up. It started with a camping trip. Our scout troop went deep into the Great Smoky Mountains, a massive stretch of the Appalachians that's also home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, one of the most visited in the country. They call them the Smokies because of the natural fog that always hangs over the ridges, ghostly plumes rising from the trees, made by the organic vapors released from the forest itself. But enough with the science lesson. That trip wasn't about learning, it was about remembering. We were having a blast hiking, cooking over fires, telling jokes until one night after dinner. As we sat around the campfire, one of our scoutmasters decided to tell us a story. Not just any story, a Cherokee legend. He called it Utlunta, or Spearfinger, meaning one with the pointed spear. She lived right there, in those same mountains where our tents were pitched. And she had a single, long, sharpened finger on her right hand, the finger she used to slice open children and eat their livers raw. Our scoutmaster's voice dropped low as he told it. He said Spearfinger's heart was hidden, buried deep within the palm of her stone-like hand. That's why she always clutched it tight, because that was the only way to protect it. Her skin was made of solid rock, impenetrable, and her footsteps thundered like storms rolling through the valleys. When her voice echoed across the hills, birds would scatter. Their songs silenced nature itself, warning that she was near. And then he began to hum low and haunting her supposed song. Uvlasigi, livers I eat. He told us how she could disguise herself, how she could shift into the form of a child's mother or grandmother, a kind old woman with a kind smile to lure her prey close. She would soothe the child, brush their hair gently, whisper lullabies, and then she'd drive that spear-like finger straight through the back of their neck or right into their heart. Then she'd tear out their liver, devour it raw, and leave her lips painted red with blood. By the time our scoutmaster finished, every single one of us was paralyzed with fear. We laughed nervously, tried to play it off, but our faces were pale. Thankfully, he grabbed his old guitar after that, strummed a few cheerful campfire tunes, and for a while, that broke the tension. But when night fell and the fire burned low, that's when the story crawled back into my head. I was lying in my tent, next to a buddy of mine, eyes wide open. I couldn't sleep. All I could picture was her spear finger creeping between the trees, whispering in that low, scratchy voice. I imagined her peeling open our tent, reaching for me with that long, stony finger. And just as I was about to drift off, a light flared up on the side of our tent. I froze, completely. The fabric glowed pale orange, far too bright to be a flashlight. I whispered my friend's name, trying to wake him, but he didn't stir. Then came the sound. A hiss. Soft, cold, deliberate. My eyes locked on the silhouette outside, a shape moving slowly across the tent wall. I called out, voice trembling, asking, "Who's there?" But no one answered. The hissing came again, closer this time. And then I saw it. A hand, raised against the glow, and from that hand, a single long pointed finger extended toward me. And in a hoarse whisper, the voice said, "Uwilasigi." That was all it took. I screamed. I tore through the front of the tent, ripping the zipper apart, bolting into the open night. Spearfinger, she's here. She's going to eat my liver. I expected chaos, the other kids shouting, tents tearing, people running. But instead, there was laughter. I stopped, panting, confused, until I saw him, Devin, one of the other scouts, doubled over, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. On his finger, he'd tied a long twig sharpened at the end. He'd pretended to be Spearfinger. The hiss, the shadow, the hand, all a stupid prank. I was burning with rage, humiliated. But Devin only laughed harder, waving that twig at me, repeating the hiss like some snake. To this day, I don't think I've ever been that terrified or that embarrassed in my life. Even now, whenever someone mentions the Smoky Mountains, I remember that night. It makes me smile a little, sure. Because sometimes When I walk past a grocery store deli and see liver sitting in the case, I remember the story, the way the Scoutmaster told it, and I can almost hear her voice again humming softly, a grandmother's tune, sweet and deadly, Uva Lasigi, livers I eat. And in that moment, I can almost picture her, stone skin gleaming, lips red with blood, stroking a child's hair as she sings them to sleep, right before she feeds.